spent my life mapping the unmappable to escape the biological chains of my omega nature. But I never expected to stumble upon a kingdom that wasn't on any map. My compass didn't just break. It pointed straight to two alphas who claimed I could carry the heir to their throne. But the real shock wasn't the crown they offered. It was the secret I feared to discover.
Welcome to another Bliss Tales video. Subscribe to my channel to keep these beautiful tales alive. New info, we have memberships and supers now where you can thank me and suggest new video ideas. Thanks for your support.
Let me tell you something about Doran before we even get into what happened to him. He wasn't the kind of person who ran from things. That's what everyone got wrong about him, actually. The people who knew him, the few who did, they always assumed he was afraid. Afraid of bonding. Afraid of settling. Afraid of being what he was born to be. But that's not it. That was never it. Doran ran toward things. Toward the next ridge. The next uncharted coastline. The next ruin swallowed by jungle that no cartographer had ever put a name to. He ran toward the unknown because the unknown was the only place that never looked at him like he was a problem to be solved. He was 26 when this story really starts. Though honestly, looking back now, it started long before that. Maybe the day he was born. Maybe before that. But we'll get to that. He had this leather satchel, worn so soft it barely held its shape anymore. Inside, 3 maps he'd drawn himself, a compass that had belonged to his grandfather, a small glass vial of suppressant oil, almost empty, and a book with no title on the cover, just initials burned into the spine that weren't his. He'd never been able to explain that book. Didn't try to. It was just part of the kit, the way most people carry things they don't fully understand. The suppressants were the thing, though. That was always the thing. Omegas who traveled alone in the wild, deep wild, not the tamed roads between cities. They didn't last long without chemical cover. The world outside the safe corridors was not kind to Omegas. Never had been. So Doran had spent years learning old alchemical techniques, bartering for obscure roots in port towns, mixing his own blends in firelight with steady hands and a focused mind. He'd gotten good at it. Good enough to go places other Omegas hadn't gone. Good enough to build a reputation, even if that reputation traveled under a different name. But good enough had an expiration date. And on the morning the story starts, a gray, humid morning somewhere in the deep interior of a continent most explorers only described from its coastlines, the vial was 3 days from empty. He knew it. He'd been rationing. And still he pushed deeper. Because the Golden Valley was close. He could feel it in the way the air changed. There's a thing that happens in certain jungles, a quality of silence that isn't absence of sound but something more like weight. Like the trees are holding their breath. He'd felt that before in ruins, in places that remembered being important. This silence was different, older, charged. His map, the third one, the one he'd pieced together from 3 separate accounts, none of which agreed on anything except the general direction, showed nothing beyond the next ridge. Just the edge of the parchment. The cartographer's version of "Here be dragons." He climbed the ridge anyway, and on the other side he didn't find a valley. He found a veil. That's the only word for it. It looked like heat shimmer over stone, except it was hanging vertical in the middle of clear air, about 12 feet tall, stretched between 2 ancient trees whose roots had grown so intertwined at the base they'd become one trunk split into 2. Pulsed very slightly. Not visibly, you felt it in your sternum before you saw it with your eyes. He stood there for probably 10 minutes. Any sensible person would have turned around. He took a step forward, and then another, and then the world went white. He woke up on stone. Cool, smooth, impossibly clean stone the color of deep water at night. And the first thing he noticed, even before he opened his eyes, even before he figured out where he was the smell. Something was wrong with the air. Not wrong like danger, exactly. Wrong like something had changed in him. There was a warmth starting in his sternum that he recognized the way you recognize a language you haven't spoken in years. His suppressants. They were still in his system, technically, but whatever this air was, whatever the atmosphere on this side of the veil carried, it was eating through the chemical barrier like it was nothing. He opened his eyes. The ceiling above him was cathedral high. arched in stone that glowed faintly, not from any fire but from veins of something embedded in the rock itself, bioluminescent, cool blue and gold, running through the architecture the way blood runs through a body. The walls were covered in carvings so fine they looked like writing and art at the same time, spiraling patterns that seemed to shift when you looked at them from the corner of your eye. He sat up slowly, and found he wasn't alone. They were standing at a distance, not hovering, not aggressive in their posture, but present in the way that a force of nature is present. You don't need to be threatened by a storm to understand it could flatten you. Two of them, both tall, one darker, with silver-traced markings along his jaw and neck, the kind that come from deep alpha bloodlines, old ones. The other lighter, broader through the shoulder, with eyes the color of something Dora didn't have a word for. Not gold, not amber, something between them with its own specific weight. Both dressed in something that was armor and ceremony at once, layered materials that caught the bioluminescent light differently at every angle. The darker one spoke first. "You're awake." Not a question, just acknowledgement. His voice was low, deliberate, like someone who'd learned not to rush words because words, in his world, had consequences. Doran's hand went to his satchel. Still there. He calculated the distance to the entry point, wherever it was, in about half a second, found it likely blocked or invisible, and shifted his weight in a way that was technically subtle and fooled nobody. "Don't," said the lighter one, not harsh, almost tired, like he'd rehearsed this moment and was slightly relieved it had finally arrived. "I'm not your prisoner," Doran said. First words he spoke in this kingdom. He'd think about that later, the instinct to establish that, to say it out loud before anything else. "No," said the darker one, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile. "You're not." Their names were Damien and Thyron. He learned this not from a formal introduction but from the way they spoke to each other in the hours that followed, in a language that was half familiar, root words he recognized from the old explorer's dialect, the one you learn when you study pre-collapse cartography, while they moved around the chamber doing things that looked bureaucratic. Examining readings on instruments Doran didn't recognize, consulting each other in low tones, occasionally glancing at him with expressions he couldn't fully parse. They gave him food, water, a clean cloth for the cut on his palm he hadn't noticed until then. Nobody restrained him. Nobody explained anything. This was, in some ways, more unsettling than a cell would have been. He watched them. That was his skill, really, not the physical navigation, not even the chemistry of suppressants. He watched people, environments. He read rooms the way he read terrain. And what he read in that chamber, in the hours of that first strange day, was not malice. It was relief. These two men, these alphas who carried themselves like the architecture itself had been built to frame them, were relieved in the way people are relieved after a very long wait. There was an exhaustion underneath the composure, a weight being set down. He didn't know what to do with that. His suppressants continued to fail. By nightfall, he knew it was night because the bioluminescence shifted to a deeper blue, the citadel responding to something like a circadian rhythm. The warmth in his chest had spread to his spine. It wasn't unbearable yet, but it was a clock, and he could hear it ticking. Thyron, the lighter one, the broader one, brought him a blanket without being asked. Doran looked at it for a second. "Why are you being careful with me?" he asked. Thyron set the blanket down. Didn't answer immediately. There was a consideration in his pauses that Doran would come to recognize as the man's version of honesty. He didn't lie, but he chose what truths to offer and in what order. "Because you matter," Thyron said finally, "and because you don't know that yet. And we have time to do this correctly." Damien was the one who showed him the archives. 3 days in, 3 days of increasingly difficult biological management, of Doran White knuckling his way through a heat that the Citadel's ambient air seemed specifically calibrated to draw out, though nobody acknowledged this directly. Damien led him down a corridor that descended in a slow spiral into the bedrock of the structure. The archives were not shelves of books. They were a room of light, columns of suspended amber, each one containing something encoded, information stored in a medium Doran had no framework for. Damien moved through them the way librarians move through stacks. Familiar, almost bored with his own precision. He stopped at one column and reached into it, and the light shifted, and on the wall in front of them something projected that Doran's brain took a moment to process. It was a map. His map. Not a copy. His map. The third one, the composite, the one he'd spent 4 years building from fragments. It was there, exact. Every line, every notation in his own handwriting, every correction and revision. Projected on the wall of an archive in a kingdom that wasn't supposed to exist. Below it, dozens of earlier versions. Going back years, decades, and below those, records. His routes, his camps, his trades, his contacts in port towns, his requests for specific obscure botanical specimens. His grandfather's compass, listed in an inventory from 60 years ago, the initials on the spine of the book in his satchel noted with a careful annotation. Every step he'd ever taken, mapped in someone else's records. He stood very still for a long time. "How long?" he said. His voice came out flat, which was the only way he could keep it steady. "The breadcrumb trail began 3 generations before your birth," Damien said. "Your grandfather's grandfather was the first outside contact. The veil responds to specific lineage. We couldn't force entry, couldn't send for you directly. We could only," he paused, "encourage conditions. You engineered my life. We created circumstances. You made every choice yourself. That," Doran said quietly, "is the most dangerous kind of manipulation." Damien didn't deny it. He stopped eating that day. Not on purpose, he wasn't punishing anyone. He just couldn't. He sat in the room they'd given him, which was beautiful in the way that places built for someone's comfort specifically can be beautiful, and he thought about every choice he'd ever believed was his own. The ruin he'd found at 19 that first gave him the old dialect, that first cracked open the world of pre-collapse cartography and set him on the road that led here. Had that been placed for him? The mentor who'd taught him suppressant chemistry, had that been engineered? The specific chain of events that left him alone in this particular jungle at this particular time with suppressants 3 days from empty? How much of a life can be authored before the person living it stops being the author? That question sat in him like a stone. And underneath it, underneath the grief of it, because it was grief, make no mistake, it was the exact quality of grief that comes when something you believed in turns out to be a construction. Underneath that, something else. Curiosity. He was furious. And underneath the fury, impossibly, he was curious. Because if all of that was real, if the trail was 3 generations long and the citadel had been waiting for his specific lineage, then who was he? Not the orphan explorer who'd built himself out of determination and stubbornness. Or not only that, also something older, something with roots he'd never been given access to. Dairon sat outside his door, didn't come in, didn't speak through it, just sat, and Doran could hear him breathing on the other side, and the steadiness of it was, infuriatingly, the most comforting sound he'd heard in weeks. By the 5th day, the biology was winning. He was pragmatic enough to know when a battle wasn't worth fighting. The heat had peaked twice, and both times he'd managed it through sheer force of will and a breathing technique that left him exhausted in a way that felt structural, like he was cracking something in himself by forcing it back down. The 3rd peak was building. He could feel the architecture of it. He wasn't afraid of them. That was the thing. He should have been. Logically, strategically, 2 alphas, unknown kingdom, compromised biology. Every survival protocol he built over 12 years of solo travel said, threat. But his body had already made a different calculation, and he'd learned, in the years of managing himself, that his body's threat assessments were rarely wrong. It had kept him alive in places that killed better-equipped people. It knew things before his mind caught up. His body said, "These are yours." His mind said, "Nobody belongs to anyone. That's the whole point. That's everything." And between those 2 things, he sat on the floor of a beautiful room in a hidden kingdom and tried to figure out which one he was going to believe. Damien came to him that evening. He didn't make a production of it. Didn't come with explanations or justifications. He came in, sat down on the floor across from Doran, which, from a man of his bearing, was its own kind of statement, and said, "Ask me anything. Did you know exactly when I'd arrive? Within a season, not the day. The book, the one with the initials. Your great-great-grandmother's. She was from here. She left during the sealing when the veil first closed. She carried it with her." Doran looked at him. "So I'm not from outside," he said slowly. "I'm from here. I'm from here, and I was always coming back. Yes, and the sterility, the century of no children. When the veil sealed and the bloodline left, something in the generative frequency of the kingdom closed with it. The land itself went quiet. We have lived in a beautiful, dying place for 100 years. And I'm the key. You're not a key. You're not a mechanism." For the first time, something in Damien's composure shifted. Something that wasn't quite anger but was close, directed inward, at the language, at the inadequacy of it. "You are the missing part of our people. That's different. A key is replaceable. You are not." Doran was quiet for a long time. "You should have just told me," he said. "From the beginning. All of it. You would have run." "I'm going to run anyway." "I know," Damien said. He left on the 7th night. He'd found the veil. It was visible from inside, a shimmer at the far edge of the citadel's outer gardens. A garden so overgrown it was almost jungle, the only part of the structure that had gone untended, as if they'd been leaving it wild on purpose. Maybe they had. Maybe everything had a purpose. His satchel was over his shoulder, the compass in his hand, the vial empty. The heat had passed. Not resolved, just passed. And he moved through the cool night air with the specific clarity that comes after a biological storm. Every sense heightened, every thought sharp and clean. He reached the veil, stood in front of it. The shimmer was softer at night, almost gentle. On the other side, the ridge, the jungle, the gray-green world of unmapped territory. His world, the one he'd built himself in. The one where he was nobody's and nothing was engineered, and every choice, every single one, had been his own. He reached out and touched the surface of the veil, and stopped. Not because anything stopped him, because he thought about the book with his great-great-grandmother's initials on the spine. He'd carried it his whole life without knowing what it was. Without knowing it was proof of something, evidence of a lineage, a thread running backward through time that connected him to something real. He carried it because it felt like his, even though he didn't know why. The Golden Valley. He'd spent years chasing a legend. A place that was supposed to feel like arriving, like finding the thing you didn't know was missing. He'd always imagined it as geography. A valley, literal gold in the morning light, the kind of place that made all the hard travel worth it. Standing at the border of the veil, one hand touching the shimmer, he understood with the specific cruelty of real clarity that he'd been right about the Golden Valley. He'd just been wrong about what it was made of. It wasn't a place. He'd already found it. It was behind him. He stood there for a long time, long enough that when he turned around, Thyron was standing at the garden's edge, close enough to have watched but far enough to have given him space, and his expression was careful, open, not expectant, not claiming, just present in the way that some people are present, like their stillness is a kind of welcome. "You stayed," Doran said, and wasn't sure if he meant it as an accusation or something else. "I was going to let you go," Thyron said. "I want you to know that." "I know." He did know. That was the thing. He could feel it, the truth of it, the restraint it had cost, because the pull between them was not subtle and had never been subtle, and both of them knew exactly what it would have meant to let him walk through that veil. "I know you were." He walked back across the garden. He stopped in front of Thyron and looked at him. Really looked at him in the way he'd been carefully not doing for 7 days, because looking at him fully felt like making a decision. "I have conditions," Doran said. "Of course you do. I keep the satchel. I keep the maps. I continue to map. Inside the veil, outside the veil, wherever I need to go. This isn't confinement. It was never going to be confinement. I want access to the full archives. Every record about my lineage. Every decision that was made over 3 generations. I want to read all of it, and I want to be angry about it as long as I need to be. Granted. And I choose what comes next. In my time, Thyron held his gaze. Yes, he said. He chose. In his time, which turned out to be 3 more weeks of negotiation and slow, deliberate trust and conversations in the archive room that lasted until the bioluminescence shifted to deep blue and then back again. 3 weeks of learning what it meant to stay somewhere on your own terms, which is a completely different thing from being kept somewhere. The distinction sounds subtle. It isn't. The bond formed quietly, not with ceremony. He'd been clear about that. Just a love-filled night and a threshold crossed, and the specific weight of something irreversible that felt, strangely, like relief. Both of them, because that's how this kingdom worked, had always worked. The dual bond, a structural thing, balanced, neither alpha having more claim than the other, and Doran at the center of it, not as possession but as axis. Something everything else organized around by its own gravity. He didn't stop being difficult. That should be said. He argued with Damien about the archive access system for 2 months and won. He reorganized the cartography records and infuriated 3 of the Citadel scholars, and was deeply satisfied about this. He went through the Veil 14 times in the first year, always returning, always with new maps, always pushing the boundary of what counted as home now. The edge kept moving. He kept following it. The pregnancy revealed itself the way things do when you've been taught to ignore your body, gradually and then all at once. He sat with it for a week before he told anyone. Not because he was afraid of Damien and Thyron's response. He knew what that would be. He sat with it because he needed to feel what it was, separate from their joy, separate from the kingdom's need, separate from the prophecy and the bloodline and the 100 years of waiting. He needed to find out what he felt about it when it was just his. What he found underneath the terror and the residual fury at not having chosen this in the obvious sense. Though he had technically, in every meaningful sense, made every decision that led here, what he found underneath all of that was something unexpected. Pride. Not the biological imperative kind. Not the omega fulfilling purpose kind that he'd spent his whole life rejecting. A different kind. The kind that comes when you realize that you are built to do something extraordinary, and you are the one who gets to decide what that means. He was going to carry a child, and that child was going to grow up in a kingdom at the intersection of inside and outside, with parents who knew every map and also built new ones, in a place that had been dying and was now slowly learning to be alive again. That wasn't a cage. That was a legacy. He named the baby himself. He'd been clear about that too. O'Alran, drawn from the old dialect, from his great-great-grandmother's book, a word that meant something between horizon and hearth. The 2 things that had always pulled him in different directions now collapsed into a single syllable. O'Alran was born in the archive room because of course he was. Doran had spent so many hours there that it had become his actual home within the home, and he wasn't going to apologize for the inconvenience. He held him and looked at Damien and Thyron over his head. Thyron was crying quietly in the way large composed people cry when they've held something back for a very long time, and felt the specific quality of arrival that he'd been chasing his whole life. Not the Golden Valley, not a place. The Citadel had been sterile for a century. 1 year after O'Alran's birth, the gardens, the whole gardens, including the overgrown outer ones, bloomed. The scholars had a dozen explanations. Doran watched from the window and didn't offer one. Some things you let be themselves. 3 more children came in the years that followed. Each one different. Each one theirs. He mapped their personalities the way he mapped terrain, with patience, with fascination, with the specific pleasure of finding that something you thought you understood had more depth than your previous measurements suggested. He went through the Veil regularly, until the year he turned 41 and realized he was going through it less because he needed to and more out of habit. He sat with that realization for a while. It wasn't grief. It was something more interesting, the recognition that the need had transformed, not disappeared. He wasn't running toward anything out there anymore. He was just checking the edges, making sure they were still there. They always were. He came back every time. Not because he had to, because the compass, his grandfather's compass, the one that had broken when he fell through the Veil, that Dairon had repaired in the second year, a gift, no ceremony, just placed on his desk one morning. The compass still pointed somewhere. He'd figured out what it was pointing to. It had taken him long enough. There's something Doran understood, in the end, that took him most of his life to learn. And it's this: freedom isn't the absence of gravity. It's not the open road and the unmapped territory and the horizon that never resolves. Those things are real. Those things matter. He wouldn't take back a single step of the years he spent moving through the world alone, following his own instincts into the spaces between everything known. But gravity isn't the enemy of freedom. Gravity is what makes the ground solid enough to stand on, what makes the return possible. You can only truly choose to stay somewhere if you know you could leave. He knew he could leave. He knew it every morning when he woke up in the citadel and heard O'Alrin in the next room, already awake, already asking questions about something. The boy came out curious, the way something in Doran's blood had made inevitable, and heard Damien's low voice answering, unhurried, with that characteristic care for the weight of words. He knew he could leave. He stayed anyway. That's the whole story. That's all of it. The explorer found the one thing no map had ever shown him, the place that was worth stopping for. He stayed, and the world stayed with him.
If you loved this video, show me some support by subscribing and clicking the notification bell.